are signing on?
We will be able to, yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and share it over to Facebook so you guys can talk amongst yourselves if you like. I'll be right back, even though I'm here.
Okay. Janelle, looks like you've got a nice backdrop.
I know. It's actually the most comfortable spot to sit at the winery, because the cellar is so close to the tasting room. There's not a lot of places to sit where it's quiet. So it works perfect.
The mood.
Yeah. I actually have the laptop on a pallet of cases. And Libbie, I have a new wine.
You do?
To show you. I put the Italian flag on it.
I love it. Oh, that's beautiful.
And call it my grandmother Caterina's maiden name, Gazzaroli's Inn.
Great.
So yeah, I have to give you a bottle next time because I think you'll really like it.
I'll be there tomorrow.
Yeah.
How are the book sales going? Do you have
they are really going well. I'm amazed.
Good.
I have so many, I'll never be able to read my regular emails. And lots of the wineries have bought it for the tasting room, and I'm very thrilled. And the Slow Chamber, and the museums, and some of the big food stores. Brian's bought it for Eto and Slow Provisions. So it'll have a lot of exposure, which is what we hoped, because Heather and I wanted it to be for everybody, from the more sophisticated to just the person arriving for the first time. And I think we achieved that, so we're really proud of it. But I want to hear your critiques later.
Yeah, I will give it publicly.
Oh, that's nice.
Did you run into any problems printing that you weren't expecting? Or?
No, that part went so well. This publisher is great. The next series of books will come from them too. They've already asked for a second book, so I'm quite excited about that. I need your help, all of your help. It's going to be
good. We'll be here.
That's good. I'm already working on it, outlining it. So.
Alrighty, so we got a few people tuning in already that often tune in, and I'm glad to see that. So I know last week we had a little glitch in our link in that it got erased accidentally off our website. We're broadcasting and we're going, and the link somehow had dropped off, and so everybody had to go over to Facebook. So hopefully for those of you that like to tune in over here on the Zoom side of things, you were able to find us over on Facebook, on the Paso Robles Wine Facebook. If not, and you still want to watch the show, which it was a really fun show, it's still alive and living on our Facebook, but also on our website. You just got to go over to the older shows side of things. It's also on our YouTube channel. Basically every single one that we do is on the Paso Robles Wine YouTube channel. So you can always check it out there if you like afterward. So I see Steve and Martha Hewitt are joining us again from Columbus, Ohio. Thank you. I'm sure it's cold and windy. Yep, it's cold and windy there again today. So good to have you again. Hey, Paul, thanks for joining us. Appreciate that. And I know that there's a few more people starting to join us over here. And then it looks like we got a bunch of people over there on the Facebook side of things. So that's great. So welcome back, everybody. It's Chris Taranto with the Paso Wine Hour, Paso Robles Wine Country Alliance. And for today's show, we're having fun with talking a little bit about history. There's a new book coming out. It's called The San Luis Obispo Wine, A World-Class History. We're going to be getting into a little bit about this book and really actually the history of our region with the book author, co-author, and a couple of winemakers. I want to do a really quick little round robin introduction with everybody. So Janelle, I'll start with you. Say hello.
Hi, thanks. It's a pleasure to be on this panel, especially talking about the history of Paso. And what I love is that there's people actually out there like Libbie that are taking the time and seeking out the history and putting it down on paper, which is awesome. And I come from a long line of grape farmers. So my great grandparents came over here first in the early 1920s and planted Zinfandel. So we have about 160 acres of old vine Zinfandel here in Paso Robles. And I'm fourth generation on the grape farming side and the first one to start making wine. So I have JDC Wines here in Paso and loved every second of contributing old family photos to Libbie and showing her the old tasting room my family had back in the 40s and 50s, and just kind of going through these old winemaking tools and seeing the love that Libbie and her crew had for preserving the history of Paso was truly a pleasure. So I'm happy to be on here today and look forward to hearing the rest of the stories.
Very cool. Very cool. Also say hello to Heather Muran with Muran Marketing.
Hi, everyone. I helped co-author the book with Libbie. It's been a pleasure working with the Wine History Project and Libbie and the team, uncovering the history of Paso Robles wine. It was so exciting to be part of this project, and we've put together a magnificent book that's going to be a great tool for you when you go out wine tasting in Paso Robles Wine Country, because we have the stories behind the wine. And so it's a fascinating read. I've started reading it again for the second time. And it's just been a real pleasure to work with so many incredible winemakers and growers throughout the county in both Paso and San Luis Obispo coast. So we're really excited to share the book with you today, share some of the stories and the history, and enjoy some great wine. So cheers.
Right on. Excellent. Thanks, Heather. Cheers. Hey, Tom, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. I'm honored also to be here and relate some of the fascinating Paso Robles wine history. My wife and I moved here in 1978 after graduating with a major in enology from University of California at Davis. So I've been making wine here. This past harvest was my 43rd harvest, and feel well connected to the history that's occurred here. It's been a great ride for all of us to see the renown that the area has achieved.
And Tom, you've been, like you said, a part of it for so long, and Castoro Cellars, of course, a brand that you've been with for a while, but I know we're going to get into a little bit of your history, even for where you were before that with the Estrella River and Winery, which also was founded or co-founded, partly founded by Gary Eberly, who was a guest just a couple of weeks ago. So, you know, rather than doing a quick 30-second introduction with Libbie, because this is Libbie's baby project thing right here, right? I just thought I would kind of actually, I mean, Libbie, I want you to say hello. I want you to introduce yourself. But then as you're doing that, would you also share with us your inspiration of why you created this book? So please introduce yourself, talk a little bit about yourself, but then go right into why this book.
Well, I am actually the executive director of the Wine History Project, which is really the important thing to know about the county. We are archiving the history, we are preserving it. We've created an archive that should be here for a couple hundred years of oral interviews, tools, labels, bottles, philanthropy and wine, music and wine. We have just amazing exhibits. So as we collected this, we wanted to share it. And one of the ways that we have shared it in the past is through exhibits and through films. We've made a film about Tom called Made in Paso. We've made a film about the Dusi family called 91 Harvest. But we felt we wanted a book too, even though people said, oh, a book, not a book. But yes, I think the book's the right thing. So we took the best of our stories after we had spent almost 4 years creating a timeline of history. And that's how it really started. But for me, if you ask what inspired me, the first wines I ever had as a young person in the 70s were from the Hoffmans, HMR label. I fell in love with their Pinot and their Chardonnays. And Zinfandel too. I felt a real kinship to the area, and I would come here to hike for years. And as I've done that, I've thought how different the terrain is, the geography, the microclimates. And I walked at the land and thought, what grew here? So like an archaeologist, I kind of dug deep in the soil to find out who'd been here, who these people were, what they planted. And since grapevines were the prevailing crop, and there really had never been anyone that had tried to put the timeline together or the whole history. That's what inspired me. And it's been one of the most fun projects of my life. I am totally committed to it till I drop off the perch.
And it's such a great book. I mean, I only wish I could open all these pages and share them with everybody watching, but you're going to have to get your copy. It's actually being released soon, isn't that right, Libbie?
It was released Monday.
Yeah,
So
Monday.
it is out there, and you can go to our website called winehistoryproject.org. First thing you'll see is a beautiful graphic where you can order the book, and we can ship it anywhere. So don't worry, wherever you are.
That's excellent. The book is about, let's see, just a little under 100 or about 180 pages or so of history of the region. I think 5 of those pages, maybe 6, are dedicated to the Dusi family. Janell, how special is it that your family has been so well documented in this book?
Yeah, I think it's great. And as our region here in Paso Robles is being, oh, can you guys hear me? As our region here now is being, more noticed for Rhones and Cabernet, it's like Zinfandel is the base of what we are known for. So to be a part of the beginning, to be known for Zinfandel and some of the first roots planted here in Paso Robles were from my family is super special. And we're one of the vineyards are still intact. They're still there. The roots have been showing to do phenomenal things. We're still selling the grapes to other wineries in the area that are doing Dusi vineyard designates. And it all started with these guys right here in front of you. That's my great-grandparents, Sylvester and Katerina. And my grandfather is the younger boy on the left. And that's what the 2 vineyards are respectively named after: Dante Dusi Vineyard and Benito Dusi Vineyard, the little boy there. And they pretty much got named because they're across the highway, right? They're both border up to Highway 101. And as you can see them, I feel like the Highway 101 is the lifeline through California. And to have our 2 vineyards border right up to that, it's like you can see the seasons change by the vineyards, between summer, spring, fall, and winter. They look like little trees out there because they're non-trellis, because they're planted in 1925 and 1945. So there's so many cool things on the vineyards that are still exactly the same since the 60s, 70s. And to really go through with a fresh pair of eyes with Libbie and her team to look at these artifacts and be like, they're genuinely interested in keeping these artifacts and writing down the history. And there's Benito farming the whole vineyard when he's 11 years old. That's just how we were expected to do things. We're a farming family for generations, and you can see any of us on the tractor at any time. So definitely learned it from the generations before me. And I'm just happy to keep it going. And now finally putting our family wine into a bottle.
Yeah.
But yeah, you saw a little bit of the charcoal. I know Libbie, sorry, really wants to talk about the charcoal pits. And when they came here from northern Italy and migrated to Paso Robles, there was a bunch of oak trees out there. So they really created their own charcoal pits and found a business to make happen, which was a lot of work too. So it wasn't for the lighthearted by any means.
Yeah, Libbie, talk a little bit about what that meant for the area and all.
Well, it was interesting. The Italians came as a large group. Around 1880 to 1920, about 14 million Italians left Italy because of starvation and terrible economic conditions. And when they came here, it was very different from the Northern California migration. They came here as a well-educated middle class. Most of them came from dairy farming. Some came from woodcutting background, but dairy farming and small hillside farming were really what they knew. It was not about vineyards, not about making wines at all. So when they arrived, one family after another from the northern Italian area knew one another. And so the famous families came with the brothers and sisters of other families. And the Dusi family was a little bit different from that. They were not the Pezzentes, the Ratas. A lot of these families had other relationships. But when they came, the first jobs that they really found were either in the dairies or in the charcoal business because York Mountain was one of the early spots where vineyards were planted, starting in the 1875, really. And they needed more land to be cleared. And these Italians put it together, started businesses, they knew the business, and they created that beautiful structure that you just saw in Janell's photograph, where they would put all of the chopped wood and it would just burn very slowly for about 30 days before it became charcoal. And this became a major industry in Paso Robles, very big industry.
I had no idea about that. You definitely, and I've been reading through the book. I'm getting there, but that is so interesting that was actually one of the kind of the first little kind of niche industries to come of some of the immigrants that came to our area. That's so cool.
It is, and the Italians, the Norelli family were the first one I could really document. They worked in the vineyards that were then planted on the land they had cleared, and that's how they learned to plant. And that's how they learned later to make wine. And they started many of them right in York Mountain with their very first vineyards.
Wild. So we're going to jump around a little bit on the timeline, I will say, but I want to jump over to Tom. Tom, you first came to Paso. Describe the landscape a little for us. Describe what it looked like as compared to maybe how it looks like today.
Yeah, well, but I'd like, before it gets too late, I'd like to say how Heather and Libbie, how great this book is. I've pretty much read it all, and I think it should be required reading for all of us winemakers, because I must admit, I wasn't familiar with the deep history that you've uncovered. So many intriguing stories, and so many stories about people just basically giving up everything or surviving shipwrecks just to end up here and end up growing vineyards and making wine. It's really fascinating reading, and my hat's off to you for the work that you've done. But yeah, just even within my own career timeline, this area has changed so drastically. When my wife and I first moved here, it was ranch land or dry farm barley. There were some almond orchards and things of that nature. But well, see, the day that I started work at Estrella River Winery, I think there were just 5 wineries extant in the entire county. And what do we have now? Over a couple hundred. So and pretty much knew everybody that was involved in the industry at the time. But yeah, just a lot of open land. I don't know if there was a street light in Paso Robles or a stoplight, I should say, but it was definitely a different world. Admittedly, I probably, coming out of Davis, I probably would have taken a job in Napa or Sonoma had it been available, but the industry was a little tight at the time. So I did end up at Estrella River Winery, taking a job that had just become available at a very new winery. Estrella River Winery had only had one harvest under its belt at the time I started as assistant winemaker. And yeah, so the picture you have up now is myself, and Niels Lutzen is on the right-hand side there in the back, and the rest of the cellar crew. The person with the cap on, Cliff Jacobine, he's the son of the original owner, the visionary that started Estrella River Winery. And like Libbie was mentioning, that people maybe came here for other reasons. The person that started Estrella Winery, Cliff Jacobine, he could have easily have gotten into cattle ranching instead, but it was a man by the name of Jack Foote that talked him into planting grapes instead. And Jack Foote had a big influence on a lot of people in the area, and he's has good mention in the book of just how influential he was, that this became a wine growing region. Probably would have always eventually been, but it came sooner than we expected.
Yeah, and Estrella is kind of one of those incubator wineries, as we recall too, with so many people finding their way. I think Vic Roberts was there for a little while as well. Isn't that right?
Actually, he was not, although he did
Oh.
come into the area very, very soon after Estrella was started, and started for a winery called Creston Manor.
Oh, it's Kristen Manor. Got it.
Yeah,
Right.
Creston Manor, but like I say, there were only a handful of wineries initially, but within just a few years, that had doubled or tripled. There was a lot of activity at the time.
Well, and I think it's interesting. I'm so looking forward to reading this book because, like, I just made that mistake of thinking that Vic was over at Estrella and it was actually Kristen Manor. I think there's probably a lot of stories that have been told over time here in Paso that are probably not correct, and this book is probably going to be the one to kind of set the record straight.
I got to commend Libbie on that. I mean, Libbie, you must have been going through government records, and it seems like all of your details are quite accurate. And I commend you on that, on getting the record straight, because it's easy to when the stories get told. I guess history is written by the winners, and it's not always exactly correct.
That's true. And actually, the Wine History Project, we are very careful about our scholarship, and we are working gradually to become accredited in the US as a history museum, but we want to be the museum without walls, because we want to always take everything to the people. We want to have our exhibits in the vineyards and the tasting rooms along the highways. We don't want to have one building that someone walks into, but we will be in many buildings, wherever they are, just so we can help people understand and enjoy everything that's here. It's a complex, I think, set of circumstances, whether you love the outside, the grapes, the winemaking, the science. There's so much to share.
Yeah.
And even
benefit, Heather, real quick. Tom, we'll get right back to you. Heather,
no problem.
For the benefit of everybody that's listening in, but might not be looking at the chat, would you once again share where people can find this book? What is the link out there?
Yes, you can go to winehistoryproject.org/books, and that's where you can order the book. And thank you, Mark. Shout out to Mark, who actually just purchased the book during this session. So you could definitely buy the book. We can ship it to you directly. If you're local, you can also make arrangements to pick up. So that's another option as well. And then just to tag on to what Tom was saying about research, we have been able to work with so many winemakers and producers to collect a lot of great information. And one of the cool things, I think, was uncovering these stories and uncovering the research. And one of the things that I remember, we pick up these big boxes of just photos and articles. And I was reading articles from Wine Spectator back in the early 80s. I mean, it's fantastic to be able to read and see these reviews from like Wine Connoisseur's Guide, all these very old publications, some that are still ongoing now, and to see some of these scores from this region. And even Paso Robles, they were getting high accolades, even in the early days. So it was pretty fascinating to uncover that. And we've been able to post a lot of those records also to winehistoryproject.org if you go to the website. Especially if you look under Tom Meyer's section, we've got some great photographs and a lot of his writings as well. So it's a great resource.
And speaking of which, Tom, I interrupted you earlier. What were you going to say?
I guess I was just going to make the comment again about the book. When I was reading some of that deep history, it almost made me want to go out and visit some of those original sites, that Libbie talked about, some of the original wineries down in San Luis Obispo, St. Remy, I think it was. I kind of like to look up drive by that site and see where some of this original grape growing and winemaking history took place.
Maybe I'll meet you there, and we can visit the Sausalito Canyon Vineyard up there too, which is one of the very first that we were ever able to document as far as the Zinfandel Vineyard from 1880. So it's just wonderful to meet the Greenhouse and walk back and see their vineyard too.
Hey, talk a little bit about York Mountain and its influence on the wine region here so early on, before we were Paso as much as it was kind of York Mountain, right?
It was York Mountain. That area was homesteaded originally. The first man that we've documented is Jacob Grandstaff, who did plant mission grapes there. And he probably got his cuttings from one of the old vineyards down in San Luis Obispo. And he had a little produce stand, he sold things. And as other farmers began to come here with the idea of planting grapes, that there was a vineyard there, and that just let one person came and another and another and another. And so that whole mountain area, all four sides of it, was right next to a trail that came from Paso Robles down to the ocean. You either could go to Cambria or to Cayucas, and there were ships there that were, you were shipping off your produce or your dairy products primarily at the time. So York Mountain, there was a collaboration among the people, but the York family, Andrew York, who was really the second major winery on this beautiful York Mountain, he and his family were able to run that winery from their 1882 purchase all the way until 1970, when it was sold to Max Goldman. And at different periods of time, the quality of their wine became very important, especially in the 1930s after Prohibition. They were able to create wine that was needed by wineries that were just reopening again, but had no vineyards. So that those grapes were shipped, or often made into wine first, and then shipped to Lodi, to the Central Valley, to Northern California. And the Norelli family and the York family, who were right next to one another, just made amazing amounts of bulk wine that went by railroad to these other areas. And it really established the important relationships all over California with our county, but also the quality of our county compared to others after Prohibition was outstanding. And that became very apparent.
Oh, that's great. Janell, I'm guessing a lot of the history of the region when it comes to your family, but then also your family and a lot of the other, families like myself who we end in a vowel, was all verbal history. Was there anything though ever written that was kind of passed along through generations?
No, but I feel fortunate that I had a lot of time with my grandfather and my great uncle just to talk and ask a lot of questions. And when we go down to the Benito Dusi Vineyard on the Ramada side of 101, every old receipt is still in the drawer exactly how they left the tasting room in the 50s. And to see the liquor licenses from 1938 of the downtown buildings they owned, and how much they traded jug wine from Pizzinti to York and how much they all did. So I feel like we learn a lot by looking through all this old paperwork, and every bit of that was held on to. And it's just flashbacks not flashbacks, but using those tools to talk to my uncle Benito or grandfather Dante about these things just lit up their eyes, and they wanted to talk about it. So we feel really fortunate we had those tools around to look at and see, and they're just so cool.
What years was that tasting room in existence?
Oh, Libbie probably knows off the top of her head.
It actually was right after the end of the Korean War. It was about 1952. Sylvester had opened and got his license and label the first year. I think Benito had to go to San Francisco and buy all the equipment for making wine. And then Benito actually applied for a license the following year. I think it was 1953. I may be off 1 year, but I think it's 1953. And he actually had a different label that was his own that he applied for. His signature is on the application. And it was open until the if I can remember, 1963. I think it was about the time Sylvester died, it closed. Wasn't that 64?
Yeah.
64, yeah.
But even the label that Benito started, he called it Dusi Wine. And I know you have the label in the book of Sylvester's label, but Benito's was Dusi wine in bright yellow, and the glass on the label was a martini glass. And it was like, what? And he told me that when they went through back in the day and ordered labels, it was just a catalog, and there was like 6 different options, and so they just pick one. And I thought it was always comical that they had a martini glass on the wine bottle label, and it was all jug wine back then too.
Yeah.
Label. I know we do.
That tasting room was really important because it was a real social center. It not only for all the farmers, all the grape growers that lived in the area, but also for the military. Because as time went on, and we had our military stationed here, they would send a representative to buy all the wine. But
Well,
there's another thing really important. I don't want to forget to say is the Dusi family took wine from jug to bottle. To me, that's like the most important thing you did. Because the Dusi vineyard produced such high quality wines, they were purchased by the Ridge, and Ridge made elegant Zinfandels, bottled them, and they became famous all over the nation. And that's a huge piece of history that most of us don't know.
Yeah, Ridge has been buying the Benito Dusi vineyard since 1967. Every single year, they take about 95% of the vineyard and still do today. And that is purely on a handshake from my grandmother Katerina back in the day, and she made a polenta and stew one day, and it was history from there. But for the Ridge winemakers and crew. But going back to the tasting room, you have to think that, you know, Highway 101 was just a 2-lane road, and there was a tasting room right in the middle of San Francisco to LA, a tasting room. And I do remember my grandfather always said that they didn't really drink a lot of wine. They drank sherries and ports and other wines. He said all the Europeans, though, any European that happened to be driving down the 101 would pull in, and they were more the wine connoisseurs. So it's interesting to see he grew up on a vineyard making wine around a winery, and he still doesn't consider himself, you know, a wine drinker.
You know, Tom, you should talk a little bit about how you got started, because home winemaking was a thing.
Yeah, that is what piqued my interest. I came from a biological science background and grew up in the Fruit Belt district of Michigan, and there was just the kind of the science and the craft behind winemaking that really fascinated, really appealed to me. So I started making home wines from Michigan grapes. It wasn't what probably wasn't nothing like the styles of wine I'm involved with now, but certainly the process is the same, and it was a great learning experience for me and piqued my interest enough to look up University of California, Davis, and move myself and my family out here just to attend school and get into winemaking. I just felt like it was a perfect amalgam of craft and science and a career where you're actually producing something, and some, I feel like it's producing something for a social good. So it just, all those things really appealed to me.
One of the things I found out, Chris, is one day I was hanging around with Tom out at the winery, which is something that we also do. We try to track and shadow people, so we really see what their life is like. And one day I asked him how many bottles of wine he had filled in the county. And knowing Tom, he pulled out his yellow pad and he said, well, I'll work on this. And I went off and was filming something and interviewing some other people. And I came back about 4 or 5 hours later, and he had many, many calculations on this yellow pad. And he said, well, it's at least 190 million, maybe 200 million. He was actually taking the numbers, though, in each year, figuring out how many bottles. And that just blew me away. I mean, that's the kind of thing that Heather and I have had so much fun learning about, by spending time with winemakers and growers too.
Yeah, if you go out to see Tom's the production facility out there for Castoro Cellars, it's incredible, Tom, to see just just the space and just what you're able to produce there, because you're not even doing just wine, you're doing, bottled wine, you're doing canned wine. There's so many different facets now. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you were one of the first people to do this type of production winemaking in Paso Robles. Is that right?
Well, yeah, we are a multi-tiered winery, and it is a business, and just like all those people that you've covered in your book, they had to make a living. They had to make a viable business out of it. It wasn't just an artistic project. Certainly we do pay attention to our quality and want to maximize it, but in the end, it has to work as a business, and that's our approach here at Castoro Cellars.
And Niels is one of those interesting people who did not start with a vineyard and then build a winery. He just started making wine with Tom's help. sold his wine, and later, when he had accumulated enough capital from a variety of businesses, bought his vineyard, built the winery. It's just the opposite of what you'd think. And
Yeah.
Tom was always there to help him.
And Neil's had such an impact on our local wine industry as well, because he was really one of the first, if not the first, to bring in a mobile bottling line. Isn't that right?
Yeah,
That's right.
that was the first in the Central Coast. There were some mobile wines in the North Coast at the time, but even maybe there were only one or two. And Niels saw that as a very viable idea here for the Central Coast. It actually resulted from him trying to get mobile bottling wines from up north and having difficulty just because they were always booked up, and said, wow, I can see a need here. And he is very astute at seeing those opportunities.
Yeah. And that kind of brings me into another question for you, Libbie, is when you set out to write this book, now I know Wine History Project already existed and you've done the movies and everything, but did you set out to write this practically in timeline, or were you already envisioning that I can work on this chapter that's going to be on, say, Prohibition, but then this chapter, on maybe some of the more earlier things at different stages, or how did that work out for you?
I actually felt that I had to have a complete timeline, and I went and that's what took about 4 years, because I worked with Bob Haas, I worked with Gary Eberly, I worked with many different people around the county to try to figure out about 200 people and events that shaped the history, that left their footprints here, that'll always be here. And so once we had worked that out with their help and input, then I spent a lot of time developing that and collecting the history in different parts of the timeline. And then I was busy doing exhibits about grapes and all kinds of other things. The book came much later. It wasn't the beginning at all. But when it came, I realized, Chris, it would take at least 8 volumes of that book to really tell the story. So this is the first one. And it's really the general history of the whole county from beginning to the present, basically.
And we should really note too, and I want to bring Heather in on this part, that it is about the entire county. Now, while of course this is the Paso Wine Hour, we're talking about Paso wine, but Heather, you worked a lot on that South County stuff, isn't that right?
Yes, and that was really from my experience in working with the Slow Coast Wine Collective. I was the past executive director for about 7 years and working directly with winery owners and producers. And so you get a real intimate relationship with these people that you work with. And that was part of the fun part about when I remember I first started working for the association, I went out and I met with everyone, and there were these just beautiful, rich stories of history of how people really came to the Central Coast, how people found the Edna Valley. And there's some great stories about, the first plantings in the Edna Valley, the first plantings, even in Arroyo Grande. And I know we kind of touched on that a little bit, but there were vines there in the 1880s that are still producing today. So for me, it was fascinating to be able to again, connect with all the people that are my friends and, I consider my family, and be able to tell their stories and put it pen to paper and put it all together so that it was not just a story of Paso wine or San Luis Obispo Coast wine, but it was a whole package. And I think when we actually really set out to research, and I remember talking to Libbie about this, I'm like, gosh, it's so hard to find information out there, because a lot of the books that we found, we had a lot of the early history, and then the later history, it was always, touring and tasting guides and different, kind of points in time where you never really got the complete story of a winery or a person or a winemaker or a grower. And that's where we really dived in and said, we want to get, the entire story. And we would spend months with people. I mean, I spent several months with Margaret Zuick writing Mayo Zuick's history, and he's important because he brought Lagrein to California. And Lagrein is a really interesting Italian variety that you don't really find very well. It's getting more established now, but it was not really found anywhere here. And so, it's finding those little nuggets along the way, and also finding out how much innovation came out of this region. And you think about people like Tom, who, started Custom Crush, at such an early time when no one was really doing that or bringing bottling here. I mean, those are huge technological advances and things that no one else really, can claim that came from San Luis Obispo County. And so I think that to me is really exciting too, the technological advances that were homegrown here. So, it's fascinating to be able to write about that and also bring it to life so that others will know that rich history.
Yeah.
You brought up the subject
And
of.
it continued, didn't it? Even into, I guess what you could say some of our more modern history, if you want to call it that, with the Haas family and how when they brought in clippings from overseas to help to propagate them and go through all of the quarantine process, that if anything, even their more recent in history contribution has actually then helped spur the Rhone movement, even well beyond our borders of the Paso AVA. I'd love to get into that, but before we do, I'm looking at the time. I want to know what everybody has in their glass, actually. And I'm going to start with Heather, if I could. Tell us what you're drinking.
I put it in the chat too, but so for those of you who don't know me very well, my husband's also a winemaker in Paso Robles, and he is with Niner Wine Estates. And so I'm drinking the Bootjack Red, and Bootjack Ranch is on the east side of Paso Robles off the 46 East. And this is a blend. Do I know what the blend is? It's a Cab, Malbec, Cabernet Franc, Grenache, Carmenere, Merlot, Zinfandel, Barbera, and Syrah. Wow, there's a lot in that.
Tasty.
And Tom, you were going to say, what were you going to say? I'm sorry, I didn't get.
One, you had mentioned the varieties, and you document in the book about some of those early varieties. And of course, we think of Zinfandel and some related varieties, but I was struck by how many of these early varieties were kind of the Muscat family, or very aromatic, probably, what you would use these days to make a sweeter wine. But I guess I kind of took the message as a winemaker that, yep, even back then, people wanted fruity wines, and they do want fruity wines, beverages, at least they want fruity beverages now too. So it wasn't lost on me that even 150 years ago, people were liking wines that had a very fruit-forward characteristic.
Yes, very much part of the Victorian era, actually coming out of that era.
So what's in your glass, Tom? Is that
what's in your glass, Tom? And then, but I'm really curious, Tom, not only what's in your glass, but you have two old bottles there that I hope you're able to put the labels up. And
sure, yeah, I will. What's in my glass is just our 2019 Sauvignon Blanc. I just kind of like a refreshing white wine at this time in the afternoon, and plus I'm probably vain enough that I didn't want to stain my teeth for this talk. But actually, I wanted to be a nod that Paso Robles does make some good white wines, whether it be Niner or Janell, Dusi, that we're all producing some nice white wines that I think the consumer should take note of. I brought some historical wines. I brought a 1978 Cabernet Sauvignon. This was the first wine I was ever associated with or made from grape to bottle, or at least had a hand in making from the Stray River Winery. And then the 1983 Castoro Cellars Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet Sauvignon has always been a big variety here in the area, and big for our winery also. But there's something really interesting about these labels. You probably can't see it, but they don't mention Paso Robles. They only say San Luis Obispo County.
Yeah.
And it's people like you, Chris Toronto, or Libbie and Heather, that are singing the praises of Paso Robles, that we don't have to do that anymore. This was bottled at a time when people had not heard of Paso Robles.
And actually, funny enough, I have over here the first bottle that ever had the Paso AVA on it, which was the 1980 Eberly.
Oh yeah, there you go.
So that happens to be historically.
Yeah, Gary's always been a good proponent of Paso Robles. You got to take your hat off to him for that.
Yeah, and he sings your praises all the time. He's always the man that's the most unsung yet best winemaker in Paso is Tom Meyer. So that's awesome that you guys have a mutual appreciation and admiration for one another.
Absolutely.
Janelle, what's in your glass?
Well, I think I'm staying with my house palate here. I get the question every day of what's your favorite varietal, which wine? I'm like, it's Zin, because I grew up with it, and I fortunately and unfortunately have a house palate. But I have my J. Dusi Zin from the Dante Dusi Vineyard. So the vineyard planted in 1945 on the Theater Drive side, so the west side of the 101. And it definitely is bringing that fruit, just like Zinfandel's all about. But what I love about the Dusi Zin is that it always follows up with a nice kind of spice, peppery finish, which I think are two classic signs of Zinfandels that I really, really love. So I'm sticking with the Dusi Zin today.
Right on, right on. Libby, I know you're sipping on something there too.
I am. I'm going to go across the highway. This is the Benito Dusi Vineyard Zin. And I just think about him often because I was lucky enough to get to know him before he died, and was very honored that he was willing to share with me his home, take me through it, his cellar, all through the property that he lived on. And I just always will cherish those memories, and luckily have them all on film, which I'm very happy and proud to have.
Shocking, actually. He doesn't do that for anybody. So it was so amazing that you did. It's awesome.
That's fantastic. That's good history. Let's get into well, really quick. I'm having a Castoro Cellars by now. This is a wonderful blend white wine that Tom makes. Tom, real quick, what's in here again?
You're gonna have to test my memory here, but it does, the blend does change from one vintage to the next. But I always like to have a little bit of Chardonnay, and then some aromatics like Pinot Grigio. I think that blend probably has some one of our new Italian white varieties that we're growing called Falangina, very aromatic and crisp acidity. And then yeah, it is. I don't know exactly.
That's okay. It's fantastic, and I do have.
I'm always working on the current wines rather than the historical ones.
This wine actually was left over from a press thing that I did where we had a lot of the tech notes. So,
Good.
Libby, we've hopped around a little bit, but prohibition seems to consistently come up as we're talking here today. There's this interesting story in the book, this code word that was shared at some point in time. I'd love for you to talk about what was it, the rooster and two hens, I think it is.
Yes, well, I should just first say that during the Prohibition era, because the Italians were just arriving looking for business opportunities, they immediately sensed, in spite of Prohibition, that home winemaking would be a big thing in the United States, and it was. It's huge across the country. So they started planting vineyards right and left and selling their grapes to companies that could make these little bricks that you could use as a concentrate to make your wine, or you could press your own wine. So, of course, that meant that they didn't just stay within the limits of the 200 gallons per household. They wanted to look like they were doing that, but they started making a lot of extra wine, and they had no fear of the feds. So they were willing to take the risk. And one of the great stories is that in the Benito Dusi Vineyard, there is a chicken house, a hen house, and underneath, as Sylvester would make the wine, it would go into bottle jugs under that. And then he'd get a phone call from the local hardware store saying a rooster and two hens, and he would know exactly what he was going to deliver to the hardware store, who in turn would sell it to the customer. It all, black market stuff is what we call it today, but they're great stories. They're just great stories. And there's one of Lorenzo Norelli, the feds came in and saw that he had, thousands of gallons in his cellar. And it was so big and the road was so steep, they said, we'll come back in a couple of weeks. And of course they came back and there was absolutely nothing there. He kept saying, well, I don't know how it could have disappeared. It's a mystery to me. And he got away with it. Really fun stories.
And that's this book too, is that it has so many of these really, really great stories. I teased a little bit about modern history, talking about the Haas family and their, and their, of course, partnership with the Perrin family. But I know that There's a little bit about them in the book as well. And Libbie, again, I'd love for you to share just a little snippet from that story.
What's so important about that story is Robert and his partner, the Prin family, selected our county to grow the grapes of the Rhone varietals that were growing in France. And they decided they were going to bring those vines from the very properties on which they were growing in France to the United States. They brought them through the agricultural and ultimately UC Davis system to document every vine and make sure it was healthy. But when they brought them and planted them, this part of the story I love is that they created a nursery so the plants were available to everyone. And many of those plants were given to other people to say, let's try it, we'll help you, we'll mentor you. And they spread all over the North County, which was wonderful. And eventually those vines were also spread to many other areas in California because they were sold commercially through a nursery that ultimately was established for profit eventually. But the beginning was the sharing of the knowledge. And I want to to South County's John Alvin, I want to say, John Alvin, who is in South County in 1979, bought his property, which was just a cow patch before that, a little dairy farm. And he, within that first year of planting, doubled the world's Viognier vines. So he's another very important person that was working very independently, studying the same varieties, making choices, and developing ultimately Hospice de Rhone, which is a very important part of education in Paso Robles every other year. So, to get the stories of both families, we're working around the same time, John Alvin earlier, but he's very important in having shaped our county with Rhone varieties as well.
Yeah, the Rhone movement, I know, is being well recognized coming out of Paso. We've talked about Zinfandel, we've talked about all of that. But then there's Cabernet Sauvignon too, and it is what's mostly grown here. We're at like 50% of what's grown here out of our 41,000 acres and change is Cab. How do we talk about Cab in this book? What are we saying?
It's interesting. I didn't cover Cab as much in the book because we also had Pinot and Chardonnay that was grown first by Jack Foot and then by the Hoffman family in Paso. They were the first to win international awards. And so I concentrated a little bit more on their story because their story's been harder to pull. But this next book is all about the varieties, Chris, and it's about the growers who grew them, the winemakers, and where they sourced from. That's the story I really want to tell in this next book so that we can focus on the beautiful varieties we have.
That was a perfect lead in because I know that you are working on a second book. And I find that fascinating in that this book is just coming out and you're already out there. You've probably already written a good part of it, haven't you?
Well, I've outlined it. I must say, Heather and I could both probably say that this book was our pandemic project because we had to work on it in separate locations. We couldn't sit across the desk and collaborate in the way we would have liked to. We just had to work as much as we could on Zoom and other methods. But at the same time, it gave us a lot of time to really focus and do, I think, a really good job. And so it's going to be much easier with the second book because we'll be able to talk to one another and see all of you, and I'll be able to follow Tom around again and all of the other growers and winemakers.
That's fantastic. We're getting along in time. We're still talking a little bit about the San Luis Obispo County wine, a world-class history. But I do want to make sure that I give a little time for everybody to talk about what's next. What are you working on? Here in Paso, we just entered into the red tier. Doesn't mean a lot of changes for our wineries. Unfortunately, they still have to taste outdoors, but we're getting along a little further. Tom, what's happening with you with Castoro Cellars?
Yeah, it's been a long year, certainly, for our tasting room, events room. We had become well known for our live music events, but obviously all those were canceled during this past year. But yeah, the tasting room is opening up under the red tier restrictions. And then we have the Vintage Paso Festival coming up in a couple of weeks. So that's we'll have barrels out for that and be able to see our our fans once again. And then also like to mention that we have a sister facility now called Bethel Road Winery and Distillery. It's just across the street from where our tasting room is located. And they're producing some fine spirits and wines of their own on a smaller scale from specifically from that site. So I'd urge people to check that out.
That's great. I think we had Max on a while back ago when we did a distillery show, and really great stuff that's coming out of there. Heather, with you're not with the Wine History Project, but yet I think you're still working with Libbie in so many ways. What's happening with you?
Yeah, well, as anyone knows, I have a real passion for the wine industry here. You know, we live it and breathe it, and I want to continue to help Libbie and support the Wine History Project. So I've been doing some consulting under just my independent consulting business, Muran Marketing. And then I actually am working part-time with a Regional Economic Action Coalition, which is REACH, and bringing new jobs and new opportunities to Central Coast residents. So that's another big project that I actually am working now part-time for. But again, I see so many opportunities on the horizon. And again, I want to support as much as I can the wine industry here locally, because it has been so much a big part of my life personally, you know, that my friends and family. And so it's a very near and dear to my heart. So as much as I can, I'm going to support Libbie. I'm going to support the team at the Wine History Project, both Cindy and Amy. And we're going to continue to bring great things to the Central Coast and be part of the wine industry. So, but I'm just very happy to see everything opening up again. It's very positive. So really hoping the wineries can reopen soon.
Yeah, right on. Thank you. Janell, over there on Highway 46 West.
Yeah, we're out here. We are open. We're outside only, but outside just means you're sitting out amongst the vines, and it's gorgeous out there. We have all new furniture to make everyone nice and comfortable. And like Tom said, it's Vintage Paso weekend coming up, which is the old ZinFest weekend. So I feel like it's just meant to be. And it's one of my favorite times of the year. And I always release my next year's vintage. So we're releasing the 19 Dante, the 19 Benito Dusi Zin. And I have the new one, which I showed a little bit earlier, but a new blend that has the Italian flag on it. And this is 50% Benito Dusi Zin and 50% Dante. So it's always been a dream of mine to have enough of these grapes and put them together into a blend and kind of keep talking about the generations that have passed and keep it all alive and what they kind of planted the way for us to keep continuing, which is just amazing. So we're releasing all those wines this week on Vintage Paso weekend, which is March 19th and 20th and 21st.
That's right. So yes, Vintage Paso weekend is always the third weekend of March. It's the old ZinFest. Maybe it'll be called ZinFest again sometime in the future. I don't know. I guess it depends on what we do here at the Paso Wine Alliance when we start making up names that we can't take back. So we'll see what's next. Libbie, you're working on another book. We know that, and so we've talked a little bit about that, but we have just a couple minutes left. And I'd love for you to talk about one of the people that was, I would say maybe so influential even by name, and then who he brought into the area, which would be Dr. Stanley Hoffman. I had the great pleasure of meeting him a couple of times over the years, and he brought in Andrei Chelychev, of course, into the region. And so much of this region's history oftentimes is kind of centered on that relationship and how Dr. Hoffman was looking at Paso as this grape growing region. Spend a minute or two talking a little bit about them.
Well, actually, Dr. Hoffman didn't plan to grow grapes when he bought that ranch. He was looking for a beautiful place for his family to spend the summers and the weekends. And so he had a very different view. And he worked with the agricultural advisor, Jack Foote, we mentioned earlier, and they started planting nuts, almonds, walnuts, things like that. Jack Foote is the one who said, I have had a small experimental vineyard in the Adelaide area, not far from you, and I think this is what you should try. So Jack was the big influence really until the 70s. It was when they decided that the family wanted to make wine, that Andrei Chelychev became a consultant And that was, they had spent time together, but they finally got to come together as in a consulting relationship. David, the older son, helped design the winery. It was the first modern winery built in the early 70s. And Telechev's really important role, I think, was to train Mike Hoffman to be the winemaker. And I know they had a relationship. It was almost like father-son. Mike, I'm very much in touch with, and he still talks about how much he adored him and what Andre taught him. And of course, Stanley had a fabulous palate. He's just one of those people that was born with a fabulous palate. And so the combination of the three men with Andre, it really created this mystique, this excitement, and these wines that then Andre said, off to Europe, off to putting these out there, and let's see what kind of prizes you can win. And Andre then went on to retire, and he spent a lot of time in Santa Barbara County, not as much in our county. I think Stanley was really the only person I can totally document that had, a financial consulting relationship that you can say, this is when it began, this is what it cost, here's where it ended. I haven't really found that with any other winemaker in the county.
That's interesting. And I knew that Jack was a part of that project, but I guess I just didn't understand to what extent. And so obviously I still need to get further and deeper into this book, but paging through it, it's so fascinating, and I do want to jump into it. Libbie, beyond the book that is that you're working on, what is next, though? You were talking about some of the mobile projects that you're doing, and I know we've tried to actually incorporate your mobile projects into some of the live events that we've done, but of course live events are gone. So what else is happening with you?
Well, I'm working with the Paso Robles Historical Society. They have renamed their building in the middle of City Park, the Paso Robles History Museum, and they have graciously allowed me to have about a third of the space to have rotating wine exhibits. So we're hanging them right now in hopes of opening by May. We're talking about Zinfandel, the characteristics and the long history of the grape. We're talking, we have an exhibit made in Paso about Tom Myers, which is wonderful. We have Art Becomes Wine, which is a whole series of Central Coast artists that have created beautiful labels, historically speaking, so from the 70s on. We have Size Matters, which is all about all the different sizes and mythology behind the different wine bottles that people hear about. So Nebuchadnezzar, whoever you want to learn about, come and see us. We are working on maps. We're creating the maps of the area because historically we can't find very many maps in existence. And so we'll always have a map exhibit there. And we have barrel making and old tools that were used to make barrels. So we're just starting to get the captions on those right now. The idea is that I want more people, the tourists that wander into that facility are always asking, where shall I go? Where shall I eat? Where shall I stay? And I wanted to give them something to look at. So we'll be changing the exhibits. We have 6,000 years of winemaking in an amphora exhibit that we're planning for the fall, which will bring in about 10 different winemakers, or maybe 11 in the county that are using the amphora. We'll want to branch out and give tours. We want people, it wants to be very interactive, and we want it to be the place where everybody knows kind of what's happening and what's happened in the past. So it should be a lot of fun. I really want to support the nonprofits that didn't have any income. We were one of them actually all during this COVID time. But this history building is important, and it's a great place for everyone to come and see what's going on.
That's great. And that's in the downtown Square Park, of course, where normally we host our Paso Robles Wine Festival every third weekend of May in the old Carnegie Library. Isn't that right?
That's exactly right. And
okay.
Paso Robles website looks beautiful, Paso Robles Historical Society website. So keep watching it for the opening and the various exhibits.
Excellent. Thank you. And I'm sure we'll do something to help promote that as well, since it's going to be so wine centric, and the downtown Square Park, of course, being such a focal point for Paso Robles Wine Country. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Next week, we are going to be talking about Zinfandel. So sorry, Janell, I didn't invite you onto that one, but you can't be on every single show. But we're talking Zin, we're talking Harvest Wine, not Harvest Wine Weekend. Come on, Chris. We are talking about Vintage Paso, Zinfandel, it's Zinfest. I just have
Right? Right.
Mhm.
So we're going to talk
Yeah,
about
definitely.
ZinFest. We're going to talk about Zinfandel and in the region with 3 different producers. I think they're all new to the program this coming up week. So check it out. After that, we'll be talking a little bit about SIP certified, since we've got April being when Earth Day is coming around. It's also Down to Earth Month over at the California Wine Institute. So we've got some really great shows coming up here pretty soon. So go to pasowine.com to see. Also, the 17th episode now of Where Wine Takes You, our podcast, is alive and on our website, pasowine.com. So go check that one out. We've got Chris Cherry from Via Creek Cellars talking along with Carol Terranova from Il Cortile. And so they're talking about wine and restaurants and that whole thing. And so go check that out. Once again, pasowine.com. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Libbie. Thank you, Tom, Janelle, Heather. Cheers.
Yeah, cheers, everybody.
Here's to
Thank
getting
you.
together in person.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Absolutely. All right. Next time. Until next
Yeah.
time. Cheers, everyone. See ya.
See ya.
Bye.